Thank you, David. It's really lovely to be here. I care passionately about this. This is a great event, and I want to say congratulations to all of those who are involved in having got it going. I think it is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Now, it's just after lunch, and you've not done very much work so far, and some of you will have had this experience before. I can't resist, when talking about numbers, asking a multiple choice question. And you're going to have to multitask. Not only are you going to have to answer a multiple choice question, but I'm about to hand dice round to you. I want you to take one, just one die each, pass it on in an orderly way. This works with school children. So, and I know how many dice there are in here. There are 77, so I'll be expecting them all back later. Now, the multiple choice question, I hope my mic's up on the radio mic. Can't hear whether I'm... we won't start with the very front row, so take one and pass them back. The multiple... well, would you trust these people? The multiple choice question is, imagine that we took the whole adult population of the United Kingdom, we lined them up in order of how much income tax. No, we won't play that one. How much income they've got. So we'll line them up in order of equivalised household income, starting with those who have the least there and ending up with those who have the most over there. And then we'll take the person who is 10% from the bottom, here, the person at the 10th centile, and the person who is all the way over here at the 90th centile of household net income. So this is income after tax and social security payments, household equivalised. We've got the person here at the 90th centile and the person over there at the 10th centile, and we divide one by another. So we ask the question, what is the ratio of the income of the person at the 90th centile to the ratio of the income at the 10th centile? And the options are 4, 6, 8, 10 or 12. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand in a moment. Raise your hand even if I've asked you this question before, because my experience is that by and large people forget the answer. So even if you think you know the answer, play the game. And my other bit of advice is don't think that you can identify who knows the answer, because that also tends not to work. I can't see, well, I can see everybody. And if I catch you not voting, then you have to come and stand at the front and sing a hymn of my choosing. So play the game or entertain us. So 90-10 income ratio, is it 4, 6, 8, 10 or 12? Who thinks that it's 8? About 12 people. Who thinks that it's 10? About 30 people. Who thinks that it's 6? 25 people. Who thinks that it's 12? Most people. Who thinks that it's 4? Because nobody thinks it's 4. Now, the first reason that we should care passionately about quantitative skills and data is that they're a way of characterizing the world. If I was to try to describe how many people are here without using a number, then I would struggle. Is this quite a lot, or a few, or a lot of sociology? I mean, who knows? There's no way of characterizing in an informative way how many people are here without using a number. And that's true of something like the distribution of income. It's very hard to characterize inequality without using a number. So what do you think the 90-10 income ratio is? Well, funnily enough, it's very slightly more than 4. And it's slightly more than 4, having for a long time been roughly 3. Now, you were rubbish at that question. You were really rubbish, despite being probably relatively well qualified. If it's any comfort, you were no more rubbish than every other group I've asked this question in the last 2 or 3 years. This is now my favourite question, because this is the question people get most wrong. I played this recently with all of the bishops of the Church of England. They got it very badly wrong. I played it once, I played it with many civil service groups, since I think this may be being televised or recorded. I won't say exactly which of them I played it with. Although you were rubbish, you were no more rubbish than most people are. So one reason that we need numbers is that the only way of characterising many things is using a number. And it turns out there are lots of things that are really, really important about which we don't appear to have the first clue. And moving to a society where people have a greater sense of quantification, a greater sense of what's going on in quantification might help us. Of course, when you look at something like this, you say, well, okay, so we know that there was this big increase in inequality in the 1980s, but how are we going to explain what's going on here? What's going on here? How does this relate to the rest of the world? And even more importantly, is this a good way of measuring inequality? So why do you get that so wrong? Well, because actually the inequality that we're most aware of these days is not 10% from either end. It's right at the very tails of the distribution. So one of the things that you think when you're presented with a surprising bit of quantification is you ask yourself, well, what more do we need to know so that we can actually make good interpretations here? And the thing, of course, that you most of all need to know is the shape of the UK income distribution. This is the shape of the UK income distribution, and there's much more information in that than there is simply by dividing that point, which is the 90th centile, by that point, which is the 10th. The stripes are 10 percentage points. We realise then that the answer to the question, what's happening to inequality, is in fact rather a complicated question, because how would we describe all of the ways in which this distribution is changing in a single number? It's quite difficult to turn the change between two distributions into a single number and think you've captured everything. So as well as allowing us to quantify, to characterize what numbers do at their best, and I think most importantly, and one of the things I'm most excited about in the context of Q-STEP, is they force us to be precise in our thinking. So much too much thinking about even really important things like inequality is rather loose and flabby. We talk about it going up or being high or having gone down without being anything like precise enough about exactly what it is that we mean and therefore why it's happening. What quantification allows and indeed encourages to do is to think very, very clearly. So when we characterize something, we know exactly what it is that we're characterizing. Now, this talk is meant to be about why we shouldn't leave it just to the economists. And of course, I'm tempted to say, well, why shouldn't we leave it just to the economists? We are, after all, debonair, good-looking, athletically gifted, charming at all times. Seriously, of course, it isn't for economists and only economists to do this. Of course, economists should, but it is across the whole of our citizenry, and in particular across all of social science, that this kind of thing matters. So let's move from a rather economic thing, the distribution of income, to something that, although it may have some economic characteristics, is not fundamentally economic, unless you happen to be in Chicago, and that's decisions about when to give birth. Chicago, that was a reference to Chicago economists who think that we can define all aspects of family life, at least to some extent in terms of economics. So the reason I put this chart up is this is another very, very surprising chart to most people. We have television programs at the moment about teenage girls who are pregnant. What's been happening to teenage conceptions? It has been dropping remarkably rapidly, truly remarkably rapidly. That is, for a social scientific measurement, so big an effect that you begin to wonder, when you first looked at it, whether it was being measured correctly. This is a truly very, very large change. It's happened relatively recently. It seems to me that's something that you cannot start to understand, again, without quantification. Without quantification, we wouldn't even know that it happened. It's worth setting this in a broader context of conceptions at all ages. And the line we were just looking at is down here. This goes back to 1990, just indexed to the original conception rate. And so the under 18s who are right down here, the under 20s, it's also been falling, 20 to 24. And then conversely at ages that are coming more towards maturity, at least in my view, some of these people are going to be quite grown up soon. We're seeing the reverse. So we're seeing at early ages really very rapid declines in conception rates, at more mature ages, for a longer period, significant increases. We can't begin to understand sociologically or anthropologically or from medical terms what's going on here unless we have good quantification. We just can't do it without it. Now, of course, any use of data leads to a central vital question, which is, well, where did that number come from? One of the worst aspects of being somebody like all of us who loves numbers is people fall far too easily into thinking that because we've got a number, we're right. Now, one of the things we know is that most numbers require quite a lot of putting together. Statistics don't just spring pristine from some immaculate conception. there is quite a lot of sometimes grubby work to be done. And so I want to talk to you about a particularly grubby issue, and that's vomit. Something I often talk about when I go to schools to talk about numbers. So let's talk about being sick. Because we talk about being sick quite a lot in this country. Every winter, in fact, we have headlines like this. This is a relatively moderate headline about vomiting. Britain in grip of norovirus as cases hit 3 million. As I say, most winters we get this story. So how do we know? Do my colleagues at the Office of National Statistics have a crack troop of people who go around and snoop through people's bathroom windows to see how many people are crouched over the lavatory? Do we test the stomach acid concentration in sewage effluent? No, how do we know? I mean, it is the crucial question that we want all young people in schools and universities doing social science, or indeed almost anything else, to ask, well, how do you know that? How on earth do we know, if we know, that there were 3 million people with the winter norovirus? Well, there is some data, actually. It's from the Health Protection Agency, and you can see that, so this goes from 2000 to the end of 2007. You can see there is a kind of annual cycle. And this is laboratory reports, confirmed reports of body fluid that is indeed contains the norovirus. Now, 3 million people, we were told, had the norovirus. So you might think there's something wrong with the y-axis here, that I've left 1,000 off. But no, this is actually the number of confirmed cases. So it peaks at just over 250. So how do you get from a peak of just over 250 to 3 million, which is quite a long way by anyone's standards? Well, first of all, you do, and this is a common kind of a thing, you say, well, we should add up 10 weeks of data, shouldn't we? Because we want it over a reasonable spell. So you add up 10 weeks of data, and that gets you to 2,000. Well, 2,000 is still quite a long way from 3 million. And it's also clearly not the number that the Daily Telegraph thinks, because the norovirus, by and large, takes less than 3 days. So if you're adding it up over 10 weeks, you haven't got those people having it. They're people who have had it at one point. But how do you get from these numbers, the confirmed examples of where contaminated body fluid has been sent off to the Health Protection Agency, to the number? Well, it's sample-based. So we know that you have to multiply it by something to get up to the number. So actually what we're told is that we should multiply lab cases by 1,500 to get to the number that we'll have in the population. That's quite a big multiplication factor, but 2,000 by 1,500 does indeed get you to 3 million. But of course, like all sample-based activities, there are some confidence intervals here. How wide are the confidence intervals? How confident are we that it should be 1,500 by which we multiply the number? Well, it might actually be as low as 1 in 140. So that wouldn't give you 3 million, that would give you 280,000. But these confidence intervals in this particular case are quite wide, so it might not be multiplied by 140, it might be multiplied by 17,000, which gives you slightly more than half the population having experienced norovirus in the winter. So is 3 million a really helpful number, given that first of all, we've added up 10 weeks, and secondly, we've multiplied it by 1,500, but we've only got a 95% confidence of the multiplication being somewhere between 140 and 17,000. And then you ask yourself, well, how many cases of the norovirus were there in the infectious intestinal diseases community lab project that led to these numbers? Well, there was one. So the answer is actually, we haven't got any idea how many people have got the norovirus. And it's even worse than that, because 3/4 of the confirmed cases in the lab, in that data, that chart that I showed you, came from hospitals where people were inpatients and they caught the norovirus. Now, do we think that the community study, which suggests that for every case you get, you've got 1,500 in the community, is well represented by what goes on in a hospital? No. So actually this is an example of a number that every single year is taken seriously and is actually a pile of, isn't it? And yet, again and again, these things are taken seriously, and indeed resources are reallocated within the primary, secondary and tertiary healthcare system to cope with this alleged huge spread, this epidemic of norovirus. Now, this is a particular example, but it's an example that shows why we need quantitative skills out there in the community of which you're a part and which you want to evangelize, because otherwise this sort of garbage gets taken seriously. Or to move from something frivolous to something that really isn't frivolous, crime. Relatively recently, the UK Statistics Authority, of which David and I are both a part, David in fact is the Vice Chair responsible for the regulatory side, we recently took a decision to take away the national statistics designation from police recorded crime statistics, police recorded crime data. And that was a major thing to do. We haven't done that to any series like this before, and it was a very major step which we thought about very seriously. Why did we do that? Well, this is some data that goes back to 1981 and comes up to 2011-12, which shows the ratio between the crimes recorded in the Crime Survey of England and Wales and crime recorded by the police. So in this country, we're lucky we have two main sources of crime data. We have a very large survey which goes out to the random sample of the whole population, which asks people how many crimes they've been victims of. And then as well as that, we have the recording of crime by the police. You'll see that in the 1980s and the 1990s, only slightly more than half as many crimes were being recorded by the police as were being reported by the population when the population was asked how many crimes they suffered. Then in the early part of the 2000s, as a result of a new recording standard in the Home Office and auditing by the Audit Commission, we moved up to a position where 90% of the crimes that were being described by individuals when they answered a survey were being recorded by the police. About here, the Audit Commission stopped doing the audits, and we've moved from a peak of 92% down to 70% now. It seemed to us, along with quite a lot of other stuff actually, that this was evidence that suggested that there really was a problem with the way in which crime data was being recorded by the police. We don't know what those problems are, and we're not suggesting that at this stage we have any evidence of malpractice, but certainly a variation in practice over time that suggests that there is something to be done. Now, here is an example where knowing how the data is produced and where it comes from, knowing that this data itself is used as part of the way in which the forces themselves monitor their own performance, led to our asking questions. Now, there are many police forces in this country. One has relatively recently been somewhat concerned about this and has had some new audit work undertaken, and that was Kent. What we've recently seen in Kent is this. So this blue line is an index for crime in England and Wales, all police forces apart from Kent. This is Kent. Kent have just recently started taking audit much more seriously, and what's happened is that the amount of recorded crime has gone up in Kent. Now, that doesn't allow us necessarily to assume that crime has gone up in Kent, but recorded crime has gone up in Kent. And one of the challenges that the Home Office, the police, the ONS, the Statistics Authority now face is that there's a possibility that if as a result of improving the way in which data is recorded, we will see apparently that crime, or at least crime as measured by recorded data, increases, despite the fact that we may well believe as a result of the crime survey in England and Wales that crime is continuing to come down. This is an example, a public policy example that should be of interest to criminologists, sociologists, those who run organisations, of the power of quantification for good and ill, and the importance of asking the question, well, where did that data come from? Something that we must ask again and again. So two things so far. Quantitative techniques are crucial because they're the way in which we can characterise the world. And secondly, they're crucial because unless people are well versed in quantitative techniques, they won't be well able to ask the kinds of questions that it's vital people ask about all of the data that washes across us all of the time. But then there's a third reason that it's vital that people are well trained in quantitative techniques, and that is that thinking statistically is not something that matters only to people with thick glasses and spots. Thinking statistically is vital to understanding the world in which we live. It's actually vital for individuals in the conduct of their daily lives. It's vital for all individuals involved in the running of any organisation, from a small shop to a large school. But it's even more crucial when you come to think of policy questions. Now, I've handed out some dice, and we're going to play a game that's all about speed cameras. Now, I should say at this point that I'm a keen cyclist for many, many years. When I was extremely young, I cycled in London. I no longer cycle in London, but I still cycle a great deal when I'm not here. I'm strongly opposed to people driving too quickly or dangerously, and so you might think that ex ante I'd be in favour of speed cameras. Now, do speed cameras work? There's an awful lot that's been done on this, but we're going to play a particular game. So the 77 of you who've been lucky enough to get dice, I'd like each of you to think of the piece of road closest to where you live. And then with that piece of road in mind, I want you to roll the die twice, and the number, when you add up those two rolls of the die, is going to represent how many accidents there are on that stretch of road. So in your own time, having identified the stretch of road, roll the dice twice, and that will be the number of accidents. Okay, so we're going to pick on the black spots. So accident black spots where there were 12. Who got 12? Raise your hands if you got 12. Okay, so I think we've just got 2 at 12. And how many? Those who got 11. You got 11. 1, 2, 3. 3 at 11. Okay, we're going to nominate those the accident black spots, and I'm now going to produce some extremely sophisticated speed cameras. There's one, which I've found in the past to be extremely effective. And we're going to pass these cameras out, and for the 5 people who got either 12 or 11, when I play this game with children, I ask whether there's anybody who got 1, and I normally get somebody stick their hands up. And we send that person out because they either need remedial teaching or a trip to the headmistress. So if you got 12 or 11, could you raise your hand again? And we're just going to have to... It's very important. So what we're going to want to happen is that when you've got this camera, but not until everybody's got the camera, we're going to want the... we're going to want you to roll the dice again, but make sure that the camera is held so that it is facing the dice. Okay? So now everybody's got them, and I'd like you to roll the dice twice more, and we'll see whether these cameras work. Okay, so who had, the 2 people who had 12, what have you got now? 6? That was a top quality camera. Who was the other person who had 12? 9, not so good. The 3 people who had 11, who were all on this side, weren't they? You got 11, dud camera? 9 and 9. Okay, so we went from 24, 33, we went from 57 accidents to 15, 26, 35, 57 accidents to 44. So that's a pretty effective use of speed cameras. Now you might think, how could anybody think this has got anything to do with how one might measure the effectiveness of speed cameras? Well, that's effectively how it was done in the early part of the last decade. So this was a study done for the Department of Transport by somebody who was associated with one of the universities that has got a Q-step. Which put cameras at the side of the road by places where there'd been an unusually large number of accidents, and found that the number of accidents fell. We could have put a pebble or sacrificed a chicken in the same, or indeed put one of those extremely sophisticated cameras that I just produced there and had at least a large part of the same effect. when we made that point, for quite a long time there was a 3 years later, a study was published trying to take this effect, regression. So that was a regression to the mean. You all know that was regression to the mean. 3 years later, a study taking regression to the mean into account was published, which said that 60% of the effect was actually regression to the mean. 18% was a long-run downward secular trend, leaving just 22% over. Now, whether 22% is the right number or not, I don't know, and I haven't followed the details of this. But the crucial point is that that apparently simple statistical idea, regression to the mean, is everywhere in the analysis of the effectiveness of all kinds of stuff, and is almost always ignored. And we desperately need a whole generation of people who are aware not just of that, but of all of the other ways in which statistical thinking can allow us to think precisely, because without it, we just make complete numpties of ourselves. Now, there are other ways in which we make numpties of ourselves. Statistical presentation is not easy. It requires very, very careful thought and dedication to getting the right message across. Silly to pretend that we can do statistical presentation without an intent to get a message across. Statistics are about communication, but we need to think very, very carefully about how we do it. Here is a recent example. National Infrastructure Plan, pipeline value by sector, and communications, energy, flood, intellectual capital, transport, waste, water. And you can see that the amounts vary, and we appear to spend quite a lot more on energy and transport than waste and intellectual capital, but the sharp-eyed amongst you will have noticed this axis. This isn't a standard axis, this is a logarithmic axis. If you present that data in a more conventional kind of a way, it looks like that, which is quite different, actually. Gives quite a significantly different message. It is the case, we do spend a little bit on intellectual capital and waste, but actually, essentially, the story is about energy and transport. That is what the story is. This chart, while it contains information, and for those who know what a logarithmic scale is, once you know it's a logarithmic scale, you can get some sense of what's going on. But I don't know whether we've got, actually, I can see we have got people who are even more sad than I am here. But you've got to be a lot sadder than I am, really, to be able to read off what that number is from a chart on a logarithmic scale. I just can't tell. I'm just not that used. Although I am the last generation that used slide rules in secondary school, I still, I can't read this. This is just gibberish to me. That kind of thing matters a great deal. We need to think very, very hard, and it's not the case that presentation is some kind of optional add-on once you've thought quantitatively. Good presentation comes from an understanding of the quantitative issues, an understanding of the issues around sample collection, of selection bias, of what's going on in the data. Then you can do presentation well. Now, some people might say this is well done. I'm not sure that I would entirely agree. Now, as well as thinking about presentation, we also have to be aware that in the presence of quantification, we are in the presence of the temptation to error, and error where frequently the national media will lead on. This is from 2010, the main headline on the Daily Telegraph that day. Public pensions cost you £4,000 a year. New piece of work produced by the Office for Budget Responsibility. Well, there's a paragraph here which I've blown up here. The costs will then rise on average by 20% each year until the commitment reaches £9.4 billion in 2014-15. This equates to almost £4,000 for each of Britain's 26 million households, the sharpening blah, blah, blah. Now, 9.4 billion divided by 26 million isn't an easy sum to do in your head. You need to know what a billion is. Converted into 9.4 thousand million divided by 26 million, it becomes easier, and it becomes 9,400 divided by 26, which is 940 divided by 2.6. Now, You won't all be able to work out that that's 361.54, but you will realise that these guys were an order of magnitude out. The author of the article and every sub-editor who looked at it had done that which is almost always done when a number involves, which is they've taken a metaphorical scalpel and sliced through about here. It's not. This is essentially the rhetorical use of numbers. So this is not trying to work out what the answer is, not trying to work out what the meaning is. It's just trying to say it's big. And how did they do this? Was it somebody who didn't know what a billion was? Did they get the number of noughts wrong? Did they type it in incorrectly in their calculator? Did they think that they could do it in their... I don't know. But this is the front page of a quality daily newspaper in this country, subjected to an extraordinary amount of checking, that is out on a simple sum by a multiple of 10 in a way that completely transforms the meaning of what's said. Because I don't think £400 a year would have been quite such a good headline. So we need all of the time to be aware of error. And this is one of my favourites, and I have a physical copy of this newspaper. But last Thursday, I was feeling guilty. I hadn't thought about what I was going to say at this event. And I was on my way to the Statistics Authority, and I'd read the heavy diet of papers for that day, and I finished them halfway through my tube journey. So at Oxford Circus, when I changed onto the Victoria Line, I picked up a copy of the Metro, because I thought I deserved 5 minutes peace. Well, this was a mistake, because by the time I got into the Statistics Authority at Pimlico, there was steam coming out of my ears. So this was the relevant piece. The jailbird. Crimes on Twitter have soared by 390%. Now, there are so many things that bother me about this piece that I'm not going to... but the thing that really got me was this, which is in the deal. Crimes on Twitter have soared by 390%. Crimes linked to Twitter have soared fourfold. No! 400% is fivefold, because 100% is doubling. Get a grip. Now, it may be that not everybody has the same, thing that I've got going on here, but it reflects an astonishing illiteracy. An astonishing illiteracy amongst people who are supposed to be highly educated. And it's not that it's difficult for them, because, I have to think, is fourfold. I know that 400% is not fourfold, but I have to think a moment before I remember whether it's 3 times or 5 times. What's the simple way of doing it? Well, remembering that an increase of 100% is a doubling. So it's not difficult to work it out. It's just staggeringly sloppy. And that is going on all over the place. So that's another reason why I so celebrate this initiative. Most of what this initiative will be about will be trying to teach things that in many ways are much more subtle and sophisticated than a lot of what I've talked about today. But for the same reason, which is that without a clear, coherent understanding of underlying statistical methodology, you will be misled by this sort of stuff again and again. And this may not matter, but many of the other examples I've used do. I've spoken for already all of my 30 minutes, so I'm just going to show you one last slide, which reflects how far we are from a country which is not unlike other countries, actually, where the truth, which would be available as a result of proper quantitative analysis of all the ways in which our society is developing, is represented by the main way in which stuff is represented. This shows how many deaths from different causes there need to be before you get a story in the newspapers. You need 4,444 from smoking, 846 from alcohol, 2,500 from obesity, nearly 1,400 from mental health, 0.375 of a death from measles, 1.5 from human variant CJD, and 22.5 from HIV. This is from some brilliant work that was done by Roger Harrabin, who's now the BBC's environment editor, when he had a year sabbatical and was working at the King's Fund. If if the mirror being held up by the media to us was accurately reflecting the world, all of these bars would be the same height. As it is, this one is about 10,000 times as high as this one. The media isn't holding up a mirror. If it is cracked to smithereens. And the role of quantitative social science has to be part of that job of holding up an accurate reflection of the country in which we live, and based on that accurate reflection, doing careful, sophisticated, powerful work that shows why things have happened and how we could make things happen differently. Until we have that, we will still be in a world where this kind of nonsense is deceiving everybody, and that's why the Q-Step initiative is such a wonderful thing. Thank you very much.